Good evening and welcome to The Late Show. Today is Wednesday, the 29th of July, 2020. I'm joined by my good friend, Regan King. And in this programme today, we will be discussing the 75th anniversary of VJ Day, which marks Victory over Japan Day. And this occurs on the 15th of August. And also next week is the 75th anniversary of the Americans dropping the H-bomb, or 2 nuclear bombs, on 2 cities in Japan, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And we'll be discussing, was it morally right that the Americans dropped the nuclear bombs on Japan to end the Second World War? And also, this is our last live programme till September. And Regan and myself will be moving to a Thursday slot at 9 p.m. Still live, and we are live tonight. So I'd love to know your views and comments. Should the United States have dropped nuclear bombs on Japan to end the Second World War? That is our topic of discussion for tonight. I just want to say this concludes our series of Second World War programmes. Yeah. I thought maybe I've overdone it a little bit, but this is your idea to come up with this one. And then I thought, when did the Americans drop the H-bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima? And then realised that that was actually next week. And since we can't do a programme next week, then I thought this is a good topic. But why is this important topic for you? Because in Britain, we celebrate very much V-Day, victory in Europe over the Nazis. But when it comes to VJ Day, victory over Japan, which meant the end of the Second World War that occurred on the 15th of August, 1945, why is it important that we remember this date and discuss it?
Well, let's not forget the important role that Britain also played in the war in Japan. There were many British troops that were based particularly in Burma. Viewers may be familiar with films like Bridge on the River Kwai. That was a classic that tell the story.
Yeah, the Railwayman as well.
Yeah, that's right. And they tell the story really of British POWs who are suffering under the hands of imperialist Japanese soldiers in various places. So VJ Day has just as much significance for Britain as VE Day. It arguably it is just as important in that it brings to a complete end the actual conflict that was taking place in the Second World War, and it enabled both the United States and Great Britain to focus their efforts on rebuilding Europe and rebuilding the society, really a healthy Western civilization across the European continent.
Absolutely. Also, I think it's also more important for Americans. I mean, I don't know what this is like for you, but I'm sure that VJ Day is celebrated more in the United States than it is in Britain. I think that's primarily because Japan posed at that time, if it was possible, an existential threat to the west coast of the United States, but also the Day of Infamy. I think it was the 4th of December, 1941. Which was Pearl Harbor. Yeah. And of course the Americans never forgot, or actually forget that, which is grained deep in the American psyche, played a kind of major role in why victory over Japan was so important.
Well, the 7th of December was really cataclysmic and actually brought the U.S. more into the arena of the entire Second World War. It also saw a greater recognition of the threat of Nazi Germany and the others in the axis of evil. What occurred at Pearl Harbor, you had hundreds of Japanese fighter planes that suddenly attacked, really with no real warning, on this base. 20 American naval vessels, including 8 battleships and over 300 airplanes. More than 2,400 Americans died in that attack. That's very significant. And from that moment, we see the USA, no questions, they have to enter the war. And not only do they have to be more involved in Europe, they need their European allies to be more involved in their fight against Japan. And what we begin to see from that point is a real alliance between the UK and the US on the European front, but also a recognition of the threat, the equal threat really, that Japan was to the Asian nations just as much as, say, Italy and Nazi Germany were to the health of Europe.
Absolutely, but the big question I think has to be answered, and I don't think historians have actually answered this well enough, is the fact is that did Hitler and the Nazis actually approve of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, knowing that that would have brought the Americans into the war, and that's something that the Germans would have been a bit concerned about, primarily because of the number of men, tanks and aircraft that the Americans could actually have. So in a sense, it was Britain's saving grace and Europe's saving grace, in a sense that the Japanese decided to carry out that surprise attack on Pearl Harbor back in December 41.
Oh, there was an agreement between Berlin, Rome and Tokyo that these nations would not interfere with one another's expansion efforts. And what you would think would bring about a real unity and would bring about a success for these evil empires that really had their own good that they were looking for, their own interests at heart, was their ultimate downfall. As with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. fully enters, and after particularly the D-Day landings and everything, we see Nazi Germany is on the back foot. We begin to see Japan lose its grip. It had taken over without really any challenge a lot of the East. We see the Philippines, Hong Kong. There were other parts of China, Burma. They controlled all of Burma. Thailand as well had in some way been taken over and was being manipulated to wage war and declare war against the Allies. So Japan was essentially the Nazis of the East.
Absolutely. Anyway, got an email in, a personal email. This is from Jill, who writes, "Hi, Simon and Regan. I'm looking at this subject from a personal point of view. My father was in India during the Second World War. He was a few miles from the infamous Burma Railway, where men died daily through ill treatment. If they had not dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, my father would not have returned. My mother would have been a widow with a small son who sadly died of leukemia at the end of the war, and my father just saw him a few months before he died." That's really sad. "I'm grateful to God for his return and for his major, who was a Christian and due on leave, but he sent my father instead, so my father spent precious time with his son." That's a fantastic story, thank you. So here we go. We have original archive footage of the infamous railway known as the Burma Railway that went from Burma all the way through Thailand. And what was so horrific was the Japanese treatment of the British soldiers, the British prisoners of war, particularly after the Japanese had invaded Singapore in a surprise attack, took so many British prisoners of war, and they were forced to build this railway in absolutely horrendous conditions.
Slave labor killed around 90,000 Asian laborers, 16,000 Allied prisoners of war, essentially through overwork, malnutrition, disease. According to the figures of the Tokyo Tribunal, 27.1% of all Western prisoners taken by the Japanese died. Just chilling figures. If we consider the people that were taken over, I mean, it wasn't just US and UK soldiers. The Japanese prisoners of war originated from many different countries: China, India. India was just mentioned by the viewer a moment ago. Burma, Britain, other nations in the Commonwealth, of course the USA, the Netherlands, the Philippines. They didn't subscribe to any code of conduct. There were no rules of war in the Japanese treatment of POWs.
I mean, leaving aside the Nazi treatment of the Jewish people, certainly when it comes to prisoners of war and adhering to the Geneva Convention on Warfare, the Germans more or less complied. There were some pretty horrendous treatment, yeah, but not the kind of sadistic treatment that was carried out by the Japanese. You only have to see that fantastic film, Unbroken,
Absolutely,
to realise the torture of the Japanese. Or another fantastic film on this subject is a 1989 film called The Emperor of the Sun. And that's with a young Christian Bale. Fabulous. But I just want to read out this because I didn't know about this, because I did know that, for example, the Japanese invaded China in 1937, before the start of the Second World War. But it says here that the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong began with the bayoneting of wounded Allied soldiers in St. Stephen's Hospital. It was continued in the same bloody manner. Roughly 10,000 women were raped in the following months following the Japanese victory. Occupiers recruited former members of the Hong Kong police to orchestrate public executions. And in Indonesia, occupied in 1942, civilians were arrested, tortured, and sexually abused. Thousands were interned in concentration camps or used as slave labour for Japanese military projects. And we have now, I think, a very important video to show you. And this is produced by the Imperial War Museum, which next week on the 6th of August will mark the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the H-bomb on Hiroshima. And this gives the historical evidence of why America decided to drop the world's most deadly weapon.
The world's first operational atomic bomb was dropped above the Japanese city of Hiroshima at 8:15 on the morning of the 6th of August 1945. It was carried to its target by the United States Army Air Force B-29 bomber Enola Gay, flying from the American Air Base on the Pacific island of Tinian. Nicknamed Little Boy, the bomb exploded with the equivalent force of over 12 kilotons of TNT. Around 5 square miles of the city was reduced to ashes, with over 60% of the total building stock destroyed. Within 4 days of the blast, some 120,000 civilian inhabitants had died, many of them having been instantly vaporized by the explosion. 3 days later, at around 11 a.m. on the 9th of August, another B-29 bomber from the Tinian Air Base dropped the second operational atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki. This one was nicknamed Fat Man and had a similar impact to the Hiroshima bomb. Approximately 2.5 square miles of the city were laid waste, and over 70,000 people were killed as an immediate result of the blast. What had led to the fateful decision to deploy these new weapons of mass destruction?
So the war in Europe had ended in May 1945 with the death of Adolf Hitler in the Berlin bunker and the subsequent unconditional surrender of Germany and her remaining European allies. This had been made possible by the Normandy landings of June 1944 and the ensuing campaign to push German forces back to the Rhine and beyond. Combined with the unstoppable advance of the Red Army on the Eastern Front, this effectively crushed the German forces between two gigantic Allied steamrollers.
But the war in the Far East against Japan continued. Considerable American, British, and Commonwealth land, naval, and air forces were committed to a war of attrition over a vast area. Japanese forces fought with fanaticism and with little regard for casualties on either side. Before the advent of the atomic bomb in July 1945, the United States and her allies were planning for a conventional military defeat of Japan, as they had done previously for Germany with Operation Overlord. The equivalent plan for the Far East was called Operation Downfall.
Downfall was designed to overrun the Japanese home islands and bring about the desired unconditional surrender. Planners envisaged that their forces would not be ready to begin the operation until November 1945, and they were expecting the whole campaign to last well into the spring of 1946.
Had it taken place, Downfall would have been the largest military operation of its kind in history, putting even Overlord into the shade. But likely American and Allied casualties were a major concern for the planners and the American government.
It was assumed that downfall would inevitably cost the invaders very dearly in this regard. Estimates varied widely, worst-case scenarios predicting several million American casualties in dead and wounded.
Another key concern was the possible impact on the substantial Allied prisoner of war population in Japanese hands. Some 100,000 Allied personnel were in prisoner of war camps towards the end of the war, and it was feared that in the event of an invasion, they would all be massacred by their captors. Orders issued previously to POW camp commanders seemed to suggest that in the event of an invasion, they would be killed to prevent any possible uprisings.
A smaller-scale preview of what downfall might look like was provided by the Battle for Okinawa during April to June 1945. Just over 300 miles from the Japanese mainland, this large island was a vital staging post for any invasion force, particularly as a forward airbase. The Japanese defence was mainly concentrated inland, away from the immediate invasion areas, but the Americans were immediately hit by massed kamikaze attacks, which inflicted heavy casualties amongst the naval forces, and that was even before the Marines and infantry came up against the strongly defended Japanese positions further inland.
The projected cost of Operation Downfall, particularly in terms of Allied casualties, as well as the experience of the bloody and bitter fighting for Okinawa, combined to increase the desire for an alternative war-winning strategy.
So with what seemed like providential timing, the successful testing of the world's first atomic bomb in the desert of New Mexico on the 16th of July 1945 offered just such a solution. This had been the result of several years of American-led research and development, codenamed the Manhattan Project, partly motivated by the need to respond to Nazi Germany's own wartime atomic bomb project, although this was later known to have been much less further developed than the Americans had assumed.
From the outset, Japan had also been a potential target for this new type of bomb, and the Allied leaders now had little hesitation in acting accordingly. The declaration they issued at the conclusion of the Potsdam Conference threatened Japan with prompt and utter destruction if she did not accept unconditional surrender. Her military hardliners blocked any moves in this direction, and the decision to deploy the atomic bomb was made.
Hiroshima was selected as the first target, as it was an important economic and military hub that had so far escaped serious air raid damage. When the Japanese surrender was still not forthcoming, Nagasaki became the second target. Even after this second demonstration of catastrophic destructive power, it took almost another week for the Japanese government to finally accept defeat. And this only as a result of an unprecedented intervention by the Emperor Hirohito, who forced his hardliners to bow to the inevitable.
So the Second World War was ended, with no further Allied military losses on the battlefield, but at a terrible cost to the Japanese civilian population, and with it the spectre of mutually assured destruction that dominated the Cold War era. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were essentially experiments in a new kind of warfare, whose full implications were not entirely understood at the time. Were the Allies justified in using the atomic bombs to bring an end to the war? Should they have stuck to the conventional plan as envisaged by Operation Downfall? Were there any other potential alternatives?
I think one thing we have to take into account that if you're involved in a kind of total war, as the British and the Americans were against the Nazis, against the Imperial Emperor of Japan, and the Japanese would not surrender, and it would have meant thousands, maybe 100,000 American troops dying, countless number of Japanese civilians, and this is something that the Christian president in President Truman had to make that extremely difficult decision. I mean, like now, I don't think there can be ever justification for actually pressing that red button and firing a nuclear weapon off. But also I think we have to bring into this equation, I think this is also very important, the role of the Allies in preventing the Nazis from developing nuclear weapons. Now, can you imagine what would have happened, and the course of history would be a totally different course had Hitler been the first to make the H-bomb or the nuclear bomb and use that in the Second World War. Just absolutely frightening. But because of brave Norwegian resistance fighters, that didn't happen.
Yeah. And if we look at some of what was going on and the thinking of the Allies following the bomb drop, we have to recognize they asked these same questions. They were not cavemen of a different era who just wanted to wreak havoc and destruction. They asked these tough questions. Is this moral? Is this ethical? Is this right? They weighed up the cost. There were people who disagreed. There were generals who thought maybe we should continue with Operation Downfall. But with Operation Downfall, you would then encounter the counter response by the Japanese, which is Operation Katsugo. And Operation Katsugo, it basically means decisive action. The Japanese mentality and the psyche behind Operation Katsugo was one that was going to fight to the death. Remember, key leaders would commit harikari. It's essentially a ritual form of suicide based on...
And the kamikaze pilots as well.
Absolutely. So these suicide attacks were normal, and the Japanese weren't afraid of literally fighting to the death. This was something that the civilians were also in support of. I'll just read, this was from a man, Carl T. Compton, writing in December of 1946. He says, about a week after VJ Day, I was one of a small group of scientists and engineers interrogating an intelligent, well-informed Japanese army officer in Yokohama. We asked him what, in his opinion, would have been the next major move if the war had continued. He replied, "You would probably have tried to invade our homeland with a landing operation on Kyushu about November the 1st. I think the attack would have been made on such and such beaches. Could you have repelled this landing?" we asked. And he answered, "It would have been a very desperate fight, but I do not think we could have stopped you." What would have happened then, we asked. He replied, "We would have kept on fighting until all Japanese were killed, but we would not have been defeated," by which he meant that they would not have been disgraced by surrender. And bear in mind, I mean, you even still had, in 1974, there was a man who was known as the holdout Japanese soldier in the Philippines who had holed up in the jungle for decades, refusing to believe that Japan had lost. It was only in 1974 that his former commanding officer was able to go and convince him to come back. He only died at, I think it was age 91 in 2014, but returned to a hero's welcome because he refused to believe that Japan had been defeated.
And also, I think we have to understand Japanese culture at the time as well, because everyone was subject to the Emperor of Japan. And whatever the Emperor of Japan said, everyone had to do in honor. So it was about, their culture was about honor, and it was also about extending the powers and the influence of Japan and no surrender. And that's why their fighters were absolutely fanatical. We've got a few more emails coming through. This one says, "Hi, Simon and Regan. There was a great program that exposed the Nazi spy working openly in Dongol, Professor Ludwig Mechuselen. If I probably said that, I probably said it wrong. He was a member of the SS and was given a medal for his services to the Nazi Party during the war by the demonic Heinrich Himmler. Keep smiling, bright guys," and that's from Frankie. We got a good one from Karen, who puts a different viewpoint. Says, "No, I don't think dropping the atom bomb on those 2 Japanese cities was just part of the war. I guess the victims were guinea pigs. Many people suffered and died in World War II, but using the most deadly weapon ever invented, resulting in horrific deaths, pushing the boundaries just too far. Imagine if the Japanese had dropped the atomic bombs on New York and Washington, how justified we would think that was." I think, Karen, you have to ask yourself and put yourself not in today's shoes, but in the shoes of Britain, of the President Truman and that of Churchill. This was a total war. This was an evil war that we were fighting. We were fighting for Christian civilization. And the only way to bring the Japanese to their knees would have been dropping those nuclear bombs. However horrendous that may have been, that was the only solution that was on Truman's table.
The Japanese had a motto throughout 1945, the sooner the Americans come, the better. 100 million die proudly. And one of the things that is often overlooked, I confess I've overlooked this as well in the past when looking into the dropping of these bombs, is that actually there was a far greater death toll in the bomb drops that were not atomic bomb drops on Tokyo. There were some 125,000 people who were killed, mostly civilians, in those attacks on Tokyo. So we have to ask the valid question, is it the atomic nature of it, is it the nuclear nature of the bombs that are problematic to us, and the alternative history that we often ask what might have been, what if it was us? You know, it's a hypothetical, perhaps it's helpful philosophically, but not practically. We have to ask the question, what's the difference between those bomb drops and the other bomb raids that actually had to happen tragically? There are no winners in war, and yet sometimes war is just for the preservation of righteousness. And if you look into the Japanese practices, if you look into the Nazi practices of expansion, this was a just and righteous war.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to add that, you know, as we're discussing May 1945, the defeat of the Nazis by the Allied forces, including the Soviet Union, and we saw the destruction of Nazism, its ideology. At the same time, we saw the destruction of Imperial Japan and its ideology in August of 1945, and it was only a total victory that was able to do that. And that's the same in the spiritual fight that we fight against the forces of evil. It's only total victory that is able to destroy this ideology. And if the Nazi regime hadn't been destroyed, or we come to a peace agreement, or even with Japan, then there would have been further conflicts along the line. But I just want to, I was very privileged yesterday to have Colonel Richard Kemp, who is the former head of the British military forces in Afghanistan, in our studios yesterday, recording 2 programs with me for the Middle East Report. So please look out for these programs in August and September. But asked him to do a 5-minute bit to camera on his thoughts on the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki using the nuclear bomb on Japan to bring the Second World War to the end, to its end. So let's have a look now at Colonel Richard Kemp in action.
Good evening. I'm Colonel Richard Kemp, formerly a British infantry commander, and it's my great pleasure to be with you here tonight on The Late Show. I just wanted to say a few words about the importance of VJ Day. Most of us think, I think, more about the war in Europe when we think about the Second World War. It was, of course, the largest operational theatre as far as Britain was concerned, but we still had huge numbers of troops fighting against Japan in the Far East, part of a much bigger war, which was, I think, dominated by US troop numbers, certainly, and the US Navy as well. But nevertheless, it was a savage fighting that took place there. British soldiers died in their thousands, many, many thousands of British soldiers died, and sailors and airmen as well. And the fighting was very often in the most intense, tough, demanding jungle conditions. And the enemy they were fighting were every bit as savage as the Germans, in fact, probably even more savage than the Germans. Torture, rape, and murder was common for the Imperial Japanese Army. And I think many of us will be aware that if you got captured, if you got taken prisoner by the Japanese during the Second World War, your life, if you survived, would probably not be worth living. And many British soldiers, along with Americans, suffered immensely in the heat of battle in the Japanese theatre of war. So it's extremely important that we remember their sacrifice and their heroism and their conquest, alongside their American allies, of the Japanese Empire when we think of VJ Day. It's a very important thing for us to remember. Something that's particularly controversial about that war is the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and in particular of Nagasaki. And I think, you know, that many people today in particular, looking at the situation through modern eyes, believe that that bombing campaign was immoral and illegal. Well, I would disagree with that. I think the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were both entirely justified. What the effect they had, never mind the wider strategic effect, but the effect they had in avoiding Allied forces fighting through Japan, having to fight street by street, field by field, city by city through Japan, was they saved the lives of an estimated 1 million just American casualties and British as well. Not only that, but also most people would agree that, most military experts would agree, that had that campaign had to go ahead without the ending of the war because of the nuclear bombing, then more Japanese soldiers and Japanese civilians would have been killed in that fighting than were killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I believe that both of those bombings, terrible though they were, devastating and dreadful in their effect, were both absolutely necessary and also morally right for the Allied forces to make the decisions to do that. Thank you very much.
So that was great to have Colonel Richard Kemp giving his opinion on whether the Americans should have bombed Japan with nuclear weapons. Unbelievable to actually think that, considering the devastation that are actually caused by nuclear weapons. I've got a few text messages and emails, so I'd love to know your comments. Was America morally right to bring a war to a swift end by using the world's most deadly weapon, known as nuclear weapons? This one is from Dawn in Suffolk, who writes, "Hi guys, my great uncle was also a Japanese prisoner of war. It must have been a terrible life during that time. Seen some movies about it and the TV series Tenko, which depict European women who were held captive in camp. My great uncle did not talk about it, but taught my mother how to say 1 to 10 in Japanese. Many thanks and blessings for the programme." You're welcome. And Ken writes, "Hi Simon and Regan, thanks for an informative programme. My father was posted to India and then Burma in a place called Rangoon. My father always maintained that the fanatical and sadistic Japanese forces would never have stopped until the bombs were dropped. The reason for their fanatical behaviour was the Emperor Hiroshima, who was revered as a god to obey at all and any cost, which caused the kamikaze pilots to happily die for Hiroshima. My father was in our REM during the war and didn't return until 1946. Thanks to the programme." And that's from Ken in Scotland, so thank you for that one. And I'll just read this one. "Don't forget all the thousands of men who surrendered at the fall of Singapore." I think I mentioned that earlier. "The Japs treated these men abominably as slave workers. They were vicious and cruel in the extreme. My father was one that died because of starvation, ill treatment, and the refusals of medicines. I don't want to think about the other things they did. Only wish the bombs had been dropped sooner. Perhaps he could have survived. Thanks for your programme, Dorothy." So thank you for sending that in, Dorothy. It seemed to be a generational thing here. Those who had parents or were very much aware of what happened during the Second World War are more understanding, I think, of the dilemma facing President Truman, whether to continue the war and take the fight to Japan and invade Japan to stop the war, or to cut it short early by dropping the H-bomb.
So Japan had one goal, that they desired to see the Kyokujitsuki, the flag of the rising sun, over that whole territory, over all of Asia, really. That was their goal, and very much the same way that Nazi Germany desired to see the swastika over all of Europe. And thankfully, that did not happen. But it is likely, and what President Truman and those who were responsible and behind that Manhattan Project that ultimately would see these A-bombs dropped. They had to weigh up the cost of war going on. The war had already ended in Europe. It could have drug on for many more years. You could have had a scenario, and the worry was that you would have a scenario very much like some of the beach assaults that the U.S. had waged on various islands off of Japan across the whole country, in which even more people would have died than died due to the bomb drops. It's a very tough and horrific decision that one has to make. And we look at these things and we say, well, there were civilians. Yes, tragically throughout World War II, the total amount of civilians who died was, I'm sure, more than any other in human conflict.
Absolutely, but I mean, if you take, for example, today, the British government, the American government wouldn't actually dare to press the red button and fire a nuclear weapon, even though they might think, look, we can bring about the end of the Iranian regime, or we can bring about the end of the North Korean regime through using nuclear weapons. But you also have to ask yourselves, but that is not kind of morally right in today's climate, because we're not in a total war for our survival. And the other thing I think you have to also mention is the fact that by dropping these two bombs was a wake-up call for the world to realise how deadly this new technology was. And in the wrong hands, this could be deadly. This is what really led to the Cold War, the term MAD, the mutually assured destruction between the Americans and the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War, that if the Russians fired nuclear weapons at America, then America would retaliate. Both world powers would be destroyed, most of the world as well. So it was a decision made not to actually use those weapons. Sadly, today, with the kind of the Islamic extreme terrorists, there is that desire to think about the afterlife. And to actually could possibly use a dirty bomb if they ever got their hands on the material. That's why I think it's so essential that such a fanatical, totalitarian, dangerous regime like Iran does not get nuclear weapons. I think that's what you can put in today's kind of context. But I think we also have to look at this in terms of where we were 75 years ago and the spiritual battle that was involved for the freedom of our values. This was at stake. It was our Judeo-Christian heritage. It was our right to believe in God. It was our right to go to church, to read the Bible, and live in democracy. And the freedoms that we enjoy today came at such a huge price. And that's why we owe so much debt of gratitude to those brave men and women who served and fought for our nations during the Second World War.
Yeah, we have to remember as well that both Prime Minister Attlee and President Truman credited God with granting victory, not just victory, but deliverance. They saw the victory over Japan as an act of divine deliverance from an oppressive regime, just as VE Day was wonderful and bringing an end to the demonic and fairly unchecked rule of the Nazis across vast swaths of Europe. VJ Day saw an end to an equally demonic entity in that area of Asia.
Absolutely. So do you want to introduce the next video that you chose?
We have a video now that shows Prime Minister Attlee's response to VJ Day, announcing the end of the war in that front.
This is Movie Time. Leslie Mitchell reporting.
Japan has today surrendered. The last of our enemies is laid low. Here at home, you have a short rest from the unceasing exertions which you have all borne without flinching or complaint for so many dark years. We also think at this time especially of the prisoners in Japanese hands, of our friends in the dominions of Australia and New Zealand, in India, in Burma, and in those colonial territories upon whom the brunt of the Japanese attack fell. We rejoice that their sufferings will soon be at an end, and that these territories will soon be purged of the Japanese invader. Peace has once again come to the world. Let us thank God for this great deliverance and his mercies. Long live the King.
And that was our Prime Minister Attlee talking about the J-Day, which marked the end of the Second World War. And I think now, I think we have to look at this. And what was so special about that time, unlike the time in which we're living in, is that whether it's Churchill, whether it was the King, whether it was Truman, or even Roosevelt and others, there was an understanding that without God's help, we would have been at the mercy of the Nazis. We would have been at the mercy of the Japanese. And everything that we've valued until then, our democracy, our freedom, our liberty, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of faith, all of this would have been threatened. And the world would have gone into a complete and utter darkness. And I think that's why also that generation that fought during the Second World War were a very special generation. And that's why we owe them so much for everything that they've given us, for sacrificing their lives and putting their life on the line. And many of them didn't make it home.
Some of the viewers may think, well, are you saying this is a sort of holy war? No, we're not saying that this is a holy war. We're saying it's a just war. We're saying it was a righteous war. But what I want to urge the viewers to remember is that there are spiritual forces that are at work in the world around us, and they are at work in leaders. They are at work in politicians. They're at work in the powers of this world. And so as Christians, we should remember, rather, that we wage war not against flesh and blood, but against the kingdoms, the powers that are at work in the sons of disobedience. And what you say exactly is spot on, Simon, that the world in that what-if scenario had Japan and Nazi Germany and Italy, had they been victorious in their endeavor, we would have been plunged into this real state of demonic darkness, where each group was presenting its superior race as opposed to all others. The world would have been a very evil place.
Absolutely. I'm just going to read out one more email, so please do send them in. I'd love to know your views and comments. Should America have bombed Japan with the H-bomb? That's our question for tonight. This one says, hello, gents. My father worked in the steel works, so did not go to war, but my uncle did go to war and fought in Burma against the Japanese. They had been brought up in the temperance movement, and the only time I saw my father take a small drink was to bring in the new year. My uncle, my father and aunts lamented was never the same after returning from the war and drunk excessively. I believe it is what he saw in Burma and the hideous actions of the Japanese. I'm sorry it took nuclear weapons to end the war, but I'm not sorry they were used. It's you or them, or it has to be them, and that's from Jay Simpson. So thank you for that one. Excellent email, so please feel free to send them in. What was interesting, talking about the kind of Japanese and also the equation of where you have an ideology that is very hard, and the very centre point of that ideology is Jew hatred, then you know that this is dangerous. You know that this is not only bad for the Jewish community, but they act as a warning signal for the rest of society. Then we know that deep trouble is on the way. And the Nazis were absolutely fanatical in their hatred against the Jewish people. But one interesting story, I went to Jerusalem in 2016 to film a documentary called Jew Hatred, A Warning from History. So I went to Jerusalem, and we were attending a conference organised by the Israeli Foreign Ministry on, on anti-Semitism. And while we were there, I saw these amazing pictures of this artist who drew life of Jewish communities in Shanghai. And it surrounded a Chinese diplomat who was based in Austria. And the Jewish communities in Austria, knowing that the Nazis had annexed Czechoslovakia and Austria, and they were desperately seeking whatever embassies would give them visas to give them visas. And this one righteous man must have given out about 200,000, 20,000, I think, even more, 140,000. I'm not quite sure the figures, but it's very, very high visas to China. Now, he was told by a superior officer not to do that. This is offensive, we don't want you to do this. He carried on regardless. And so, therefore, there was a whole community of Jewish people living in Shanghai. Then the Nazis invaded, the Japanese invaded, and they took control of Shanghai. And the Nazi says, we want the Jews to Shanghai. Put them on a boat, either give them to us or put them on a boat and blow them up. And the Japanese said, no, we want money. And the price was too high, even for the Nazis to actually pay, which then saved the lives of the Jewish community in Shanghai. And today, because of that, thousands Jewish people are alive by the act of one righteous diplomat. So I think we can take and look at VJ Day and V-Day, what happened during World War II, and think there were incredibly moral, courageous mavericks who defied fear and the threat of their own life to save others. And I think these are some of the most compelling stories of that era. And it makes us think that we are again living in a time where we are approaching a breakdown of our own laws, a breakdown of our Judeo-Christian heritage, and a time when we could face persecution. And I think that big question is, what do we do in the midst of that situation? And what God gives us the strength and the power to help other people, even though that will cost us our own lives.
Absolutely. Will we stand up? Will we stand strong? Will we endure? The only way that we can, and the only way we can continue to press on regardless of persecution, is if we stand strong in the Lord and the strength of His might, right? So we need to be aware of our commander, the Lord Jesus Christ. When we're with Him, victory is assured. We need to be aware of our enemy and the constant attacks that are going to be very subtle at times, very strategic in their onslaught. If we are aware of our commander, and if we're aware of our enemy, and if we are continuing to put on the full armor of God, we can't lose.
Amen. So let's have a look now at this excellent video. And this is America celebrating VJ Day, which occurred on the 15th of August, 1945. And this is President Truman's inspirational words.
It was a long road to Tokyo and a bloody one. We shall not forget Pearl Harbor. The evil done by the Japanese warlords can never be repaired or forgotten. But their power to destroy and kill has been taken from them. Their armies and what is left of their navy are now impotent. Our first thoughts, of course, go out to those of our loved ones who have been killed or maimed in this terrible war. On land and sea and in the air, American men and women have given their lives so that this day of ultimate victory might come and assure the survival of a civilized world. No victory can make good their loss. We think of those whom death in this war has hurt, taking from them fathers, husbands, sons, brothers, and sisters whom they love. No victory can bring back the faces they long to see. Only the knowledge that the victory which these sacrifices have made possible will be wisely used can give them any comfort. It is our responsibility, ours the living, to see to it that this victory shall be a monument worthy of the dead who died to win it. And so on VJ Day, we take renewed faith and pride in our own way of life. God's help has brought us to this day of victory. With His help, we will attain that peace and prosperity for ourselves and all the world in the years ahead.
And let's also remember that history is His story. It's God's story. And that God unexpectedly raised up President Truman, not only to bring about the end of the Second World War, but President Truman played a major role in re-establishing the modern state of Israel because he went against his own State Department, he went against his own intelligence officials such as the CIA, including the US State Department, who said do not support and do not recognize this modern state of Israel because we believe it'll only last a week. Don't invest American political power and interest in this small Jewish state in the Middle East. And of course he did, and the rest is history.
That's leadership.
Absolutely.
And if we look at a lot of the choices that Truman made in the lead up to the dropping of the H-bomb, we see crystal clear leadership. Unpopular in many cases, but it brought an end to the war.
Absolutely right. I've got, I think, 2 minutes left of the programme, so I think I've got time for 2 more emails. This one was, my dad was in the RAF in Burma during the Second World War. He was taken captive 6 months before the end of the war in Rangoon jail. He said he used to hear his comrades being tortured at night. He could hear their screams. He worked on the railway. I thank the Lord he survived. The Japanese did not want to give in. Something had to be done, as terrible as that sounds today. They were warned, but like Pharaoh in Egypt, they ignored them. And that's Jeanette, so thank you for that one, Jeanette. And Susan writes, hi Simon, my uncle was in a Japanese prisoner of war and worked on the infamous railway. The Japanese were so sadistic and wickedly, horribly cruel to civilians and military alike. And the H-bomb definitely brought a halt to the war and saved many lives and much suffering. We must never forget the USA did the right thing. Bless you, Susan. So thank you for the programme tonight, and thank you for choosing such an excellent topic, Regan. I've enjoyed our mini-series of looking back to the Second World War, and I want to thank you for watching The Late Show tonight. I think one thing we can learn is that God is sovereign and He is in control, but also want to remind you that we won't be on The Late Show in August because the channel is taking a break, but we will be back in September, where Regan and I will be on a Thursday night at 9 p.m. You can also watch brand new, fresh episodes of the Middle East Report during the month of August, so that will keep you occupied. So I just want to thank you for watching The Late Show, and it's so important that we look back and remember God's hand of mercy on our nation and upon the world as we mark the end of the Second World War on the 15th of August, 1945. VJ Day.